Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is something deeply, instinctively unsettling about the idea of losing time. Not forgetting it, not wasting it, but having it taken from you by something vast and indifferent, something that doesn't acknowledge the difference between a second and a century. We anchor ourselves to time the way sailors anchor to a harbour wall. It tells us where we are, what we have done, who we will become. It tells us that our loved ones are still out there, still breathing, is still waiting for us to come home. Strip time away, and you strip away the most fundamental orientation a person has. You are left floating, untethered, in a darkness that has no shore. Now imagine you are the crew of an imperial void ship. You have lived your entire life in the belly of a vessel the size of a small city, breathing recycled air, eating from hydroponics bays, praying to the God Emperor of mankind that the machine spirits of your ship will hold together through one more journey. You are about to enter the warp. Your navigator, that pale and strange figure sealed behind the thick blast doors of the navigation sanctum, sits in her chair and opens her third eye. The eye that other people cover when they are around her, because to look at it is to go mad or simply to die. She opens that eye and she looks, not at the stars, but through them, into the seething, screaming unreality of the Imperium. She looks for the light of the Astronomicon, that psychic beacon powered by the dying screams of 10,000 psychers each and every day on holy terror, burning across 70,000 light-years of warp space like a lighthouse at the edge of a hurricane. She finds it. She nods. The warp drive spins up. The hull groans. And then your ship ceases to exist in the physical universe. You do not vanish. You do not sleep. You are still there, still breathing, still eating and arguing and praying. But the universe outside your Geller field, that invisible bubble of real space projected around your vessel like a soap bubble holding back an ocean, is no longer the universe you left. It is the warp, the immaterium, the sea of souls, and time in that place is not what you think it is. When your ship re-enters real space, when the warp drive powers down and reality crashes back around you like a wave, it might be a day later, it might be a week, it might be 3 centuries. You will not know until you make contact with someone who was never in the warp, who stayed behind in the place where clocks still worked. Only then will you discover what the Imperium ate while you were swimming through it. Only then will you learn whether the person you kissed goodbye is still alive, whether the war you were sailing to fight has been over for 100 years, whether the world you called home still remembers your name. This is the reality of warp travel in Warhammer 40,000. And it is, without question, one of the most quietly devastating things in this entire universe of over-the-top, galaxy-spanning horror. Today, we are going to go deep into this topic, not just the surface-level explanation. Yes, time moves differently in the warp. Yes, ships can arrive late. Yes, it's bad. But the real texture of it, the mechanical reality of how the warp interacts with time, the psychological weight it places on the billions of souls who travel through it, the specific, documented cases in the lore where this phenomenon has produced outcomes so strange and terrible that even by the standards of the 41st millennium, they stand out as singular horrors. We are going to talk about ghost ships and frozen crews. We are going to talk about a space marine chapter that entered the warp and came back as something that should not exist. We are going to talk about a wound torn across the entire galaxy that broke time itself on a cosmic scale. And we are going to talk about the quiet, personal devastation. The man who ships out for what feels like 6 months, steps off the transport, and discovers that his grandchildren are already old. So settle in. Take your time, because in this particular corner of the galaxy, time is the one thing you can never afford to waste. Before we get into the deeper mechanics, it is worth establishing one more thing about why this topic matters beyond its individual examples. Warhammer 40,000 is a setting that deals in extremes. giant armored super soldiers, galaxy-spanning empires, gods of chaos whose influence can corrupt entire star systems. The scale of everything is deliberately, almost comically, excessive, and that excess is part of its appeal. When you are dealing at these scales, individual human suffering can become abstracted, a casualty figure, a statistic, a footnote in a campaign report. The temporal horror of warp travel resists that abstraction. But because the thing it takes from you, time, the subjective experience of your own life, the shared chronology that connects you to everyone you love, is not something that can be measured in gigatons of explosive yield or the number of worlds affected. It is something that every single human being understands instinctively, regardless of how far removed from 40k's specifics they might be. You do not need to know what a space marine is to understand what it would mean to step off a ship and find out your children are old. You do not need to understand the mechanics of the Geller field to find something deeply unsettling about the idea of a ship frozen at a single moment in time, its crew preserved mid-breath, while 10,000 years flow around them. This is, I think, one of the ways that Warhammer 40,000 at its best manages to be more than just spectacle. And underneath the battle scenes, and the glorious excess, and the faction warfare, and the lore debates about whether the Space Wolves would beat the Ultramarines in a straight fight, there are moments where this universe says something genuinely true about what it means to be a small, mortal, time-bound thing in a universe that is very old and very indifferent. The temporal elements of warp travel are one of those moments. They are worth taking seriously. Let us begin at the beginning, or let us begin with the warp itself. Section 2. The Imperium, a universe without clocks. To understand why time behaves so strangely during warp travel, you first need to understand what the warp actually is. And to do that, you need to set aside almost everything you know about physics, causality, and the nature of reality. Not because those things are wrong, but because the warp is a place where they simply do not apply. The Imperium, also known as the warp, the Empyrean, the Sea of Souls, like chaos, is a parallel dimension that exists alongside real space. Every point in the physical universe has a corresponding point in the warp, which is part of how it can serve as a medium for faster-than-light travel. You enter the warp at one point, traverse its energies, and emerge at another, having covered a distance that would take millennia at conventional speeds. In that basic mechanical sense, the warp is simply a shortcut. Yes, a tunnel through the fabric of space that intelligent species learn to exploit. But the similarity to anything as comforting as a tunnel ends there. The warp is made of psychic energy. More specifically, it is made of the emotions, thoughts, dreams, fears, and spiritual residue of every sentient creature that has ever lived in the physical universe. Every war ever fought, every prayer ever whispered, and every dream ever had, and every nightmare ever endured. These things generate psychic resonance, and that resonance bleeds into the Imperium. The warp is, in the most literal possible sense, a dimension of pure feeling. It is raw emotion given physical form and infinite extent. Rage becomes a howling storm. Despair becomes a becalmed void that drains the life from everything it touches. Joy, hope, love, these things exist in the warp too, but in the 41st millennium. And after 10,000 years of galactic-scale war and suffering, they are very small candles in a very large darkness. Now, what does this mean for time? In the physical universe, time is a dimension. It flows in one direction at a consistent rate, and the laws of physics are consistent with this flow. Cause comes before effect. An event that happened yesterday happened before an event that is happening today. Yet the clock on the wall and the clock in the next star system tick at rates that are comparable, measurable, predictable. In the warp, none of this is true. Because the warp is made of emotion and thought rather than matter and energy, it obeys completely different rules. Or rather, it obeys no rules at all in the conventional sense. The currents of the Imperium shift and surge with the emotional tides of the galaxy's billions of inhabitants. A great war in real space creates a storm in the warp. A mass extinction generates a psychic shockwave. The birth of a chaos god, as happened when the Elder Empire collapsed 40,000 years ago, giving birth to Slaanesh, literally tore a permanent wound in the boundary between the two dimensions and created the Eye of Terror, a region where the warp and real space have been bleeding into each other ever since. In this environment, the concept of a consistent flow of time is simply inapplicable. Time in the warp moves like the currents of a river that has no fixed source and no fixed destination, that runs sometimes backward and sometimes sideways, that pools in eddies of terrifying stillness and rushes through rapids of compressed chaos. Some regions of the warp experience the passage of time extremely slowly relative to real space. Other regions experience it faster. There are pockets, temporal bubbles, essentially where time has stopped entirely, or where it loops, or where cause and effect have become so entangled that the distinction between past and future is meaningless. The scholars of the Imperium who have studied this phenomenon, the chronoscribes of the Adeptus Administratum, the rare savants of the Ordo Chronos, the navigators whose entire lives are spent in contact with the warp's flow, have developed ways of describing and categorizing these effects. They speak of warp tides, as of temporal eddies, of chronal distortion fields. They have produced tables that attempt to quantify the average relationship between time spent in the warp and time elapsed in real space. But they are always careful, the good ones, the ones who survive long enough to teach their successors, to emphasize that these tables are averages. They are rough guides to a phenomenon that ultimately defies prediction. And then there are the chaos gods themselves. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, the lord of change. This being is a creature of time in a way that almost defies description. Tzeentch exists in all moments simultaneously. It perceives the tangled threads of fate and causality across thousands of possible futures and pasts, and it manipulates them for its own inscrutable purposes. When a ship traveling through the warp encounters a region saturated with Tzeentchian influence, the temporal effects become not merely unpredictable, but genuinely surreal. The ship might experience time running backward. The crew might have memories of things that have not yet happened, or lose memories of things that did. The clocks might run perfectly correctly, but the events they are measuring might be occurring in the wrong order. This is the ocean that every Imperial void ship must cross when it leaves one star system and heads for another. This is the medium through which the Imperium of Man conducts all of its interstellar trade, communication, and war. There is no alternative. The Eldar use the webway, those tunnels carved through the boundary between real space and the warp that bypass the Imperium entirely. But humanity never mastered that technology. The Tau use drives that skim the surface of the warp rather than entering it, which is slower but safer, though even they are not entirely immune to temporal effects. The Necrons use phase technology that sidesteps the warp altogether, but the Imperium of Man, and that vast and creaking engine of humanity's survival, has no such options. Its 10,000 worlds are connected by routes that run through the worst place in the universe, and it manages, somehow, barely, day by day, ship by ship, prayer by prayer, sacrifice by sacrifice, but always at a cost, and time is always part of that cost. Section 3. The mechanics of the jump. From Mandeville points to madness, let us follow a ship through a warp transit, a real one, with all the terrifying procedural reality that 40,000 lore gives us. Because part of what makes this topic so compelling is that the Imperium has not simply thrown its hands up and declared warp travel an unknowable mystery. It has, in its grim and methodical way, tried to make it safe. It has tried to make it routine. And in that gap between the attempt to impose order and the utter impossibility of fully doing so, some of the most haunting stories in the entire setting emerge. The first thing you need to know is where you enter the warp. Ships do not simply pop into the Imperium at any convenient moment. Entering the warp, called making a translation or making a jump, requires specific conditions. The tidal forces generated by a star's mass make translation dangerous, potentially fatal, near a stellar body. The larger and more massive the star, the greater the gravitational interference with the warp drive. As a result, the ships must travel out to what are called Mandeville points, the minimum safe distance from a star where a warp translation can be attempted without the gravitational gradient tearing the ship apart. For a star like our own Sun, this is typically somewhere out beyond the outer planets of the system, in the cold dark of deep space. This means that every interstellar journey has two phases that can take weeks in their own right. First, at the real space cruise from wherever you started to the edge of the system, using conventional reaction drives at sublight speeds, then the warp transit itself, then the sublight cruise from the edge of the destination system into whatever planetary body you are heading for. The sheer scale of these journeys is almost impossible to process at an instinctive level, as we are talking about a universe so large that even the short parts of a journey, the parts that happen at conventional speeds in normal space, can take weeks or months. But once you have reached the Mandeville point, the real process begins. The ship's navigator is the linchpin of everything that follows. A navigator is not quite human in the conventional sense. They are a subspecies called Homo navigo, at carrying the navigator gene, a mutation that emerged in humanity around the 22nd millennium of our common calendar during the dark age of technology. This gene gives its bearer a third eye in the center of their forehead, covered under normal circumstances by a diadem or a blindfold to protect those around them from what it can do. But in the navigation sanctum, sealed away behind blast doors and surrounded by the ship's machine spirits and instruments, the navigator removes that blindfold and opens that eye. Through their warp eye, the navigator can see the Imperium directly. They can perceive its tides and currents, its storms and its doldrums, the way a ship's captain might read the surface of a sea. And most critically, they can perceive the Astronomicon, that vast psychic lighthouse burning from holy terror, powered by the sacrifice of thousands of psychers every single day, pumping its signal across a sphere roughly 70,000 light-years in radius. The Astronomicon is the fixed reference point, the North Star, the one stable feature in an otherwise featureless and constantly shifting ocean. Without it, navigation is a nightmare. With it, navigation is merely very difficult. Once the navigator has taken their reading and calculated a course, the warp drive activates. This is a massive piece of machinery, as taking up a significant portion of the ship's aft sections, huge, complex, and imperfectly understood even by the tech priests who maintain it. The drive does not propel the ship in the conventional sense. It tears a hole in reality. It creates a transitional aperture between real space and the warp, and the ship slides through. At the moment of translation, the Geller field becomes the only thing standing between the crew and annihilation. What the Geller field, named after some forgotten inventor from the age of technology, is a device that projects what can only be described as a bubble of real space around the ship. It maintains the physical laws of the material universe within a defined perimeter, pushing back the warp outside that boundary. Within the Geller field, the ship remains physically real. Gravity works. Oxygen stays oxygen. Steel stays steel. The clocks theoretically keep ticking. The crew does not dissolve into the psychic medium of the Imperium, the demons that inhabit the warp, and they are very real, very hungry, and very close, are kept on the other side of an invisible barrier that they are constantly, ceaselessly trying to break through. Some Geller field generators work purely on technology. Others, and this is one of the more disturbing revelations in the lore, or something that was apparently always true in the internal lore of Games Workshop even if it wasn't always publicly stated, are powered in part by psychers kept in a permanent comatose state, their dreaming minds projecting the bubble of reality around the ship. The ship literally sails through hell, using someone's dream as its shield, and those psychers die. The process burns through them, and they must be replaced regularly on certain ships, on certain, as the consumption of these dreaming souls is one of the logistical considerations of any long voyage. Inside this bubble, the crew lives their lives. They eat their meals, they tend to the engines, they argue and pray and tell stories to stay sane, they sleep. And outside the bubble, on the other side of a barrier they can sometimes hear straining and crackling under pressure, is something that wants them, whilst something that finds the heat of their consciousness irresistible in the cold dark of the Imperium. This is the journey. Days, sometimes. Weeks, sometimes. Months, in the case of very long transits or particularly difficult conditions. The navigator guides as best she can, threading between the storms, following the light of the Astronomicon, reading the currents and the tides. And all the while, time, real time, the time being lived by everyone outside the warp, continues to pass outside, at a rate that has essentially no relationship to the rate being experienced inside. Section 4. The 1:12 ratio and the mathematics of lost years. The standard approximation, given in various editions of the Warhammer 40,000 rules and background material, is what is commonly called the 1:12 ratio. For every single day experienced aboard a ship in the warp, approximately 12 days pass in real space. So if a journey takes you 3 weeks in subjective time, 3 weeks of eating, sleeping, and standing watch and praying, you will emerge from the warp to find that approximately 5.5 months have passed in the outside universe. That is the average. Under calm warp conditions, on well-charted routes, with a skilled navigator and a functioning Astronomicon, the ratio can be much more favorable. Some routes, the great warp highways carved out over millennia of navigation, yes, their currents relatively predictable, and their hazards at least documented if not eliminated, can be transited at ratios much closer to 1:1. Short hops between neighboring systems, well within the Astronomicon's influence, across regions where the warp runs quiet, can be almost predictable in their timings. But the 1:12 ratio is an average, and averages are calculated from a distribution that extends very far in both directions. When things go badly, the ratio does not simply become less favorable. It can become catastrophic. A ship caught in a warp storm, those raging tempests of psychic energy that spring up without warning and can last for anything from a few hours to several centuries, may find itself trapped for what feels like days aboard ship, while years, decades, or even centuries thunder past in real space. The storm does not cease simply because the crew is suffering. The storm is indifferent. The warp is indifferent. And the ship just has to hold together until conditions improve. The navigator finds a route out, or everyone dies. There are documented cases in the lore, some presented as historical fact within the setting, others as cautionary tales passed between voidfarers, in the same tone that sailors once whispered about ghost ships, of vessels emerging from the warp to find that their journey of what felt like a few months had resulted in an absence of 200 years. 300 years, but in extreme cases, more. The crew steps off the ship into a galaxy that has moved on without them in every meaningful sense. The war they were sailing to fight has been fought, won or lost, and largely forgotten. The loved ones who waved them off from the docking bay are long dead. The organization they served may have been restructured, dissolved, or redefined beyond recognition. And the crew is left to navigate a world they no longer belong to, which with all of their memories and relationships and commitments intact and absolutely impossible to honor. There is a particular kind of grief described in the accounts of this phenomenon that does not have a name in most languages. It is not quite bereavement, because the people you loved did not die while you were watching. You simply weren't there. It is not exile, because you never left the Imperium. It is something closer to what happens when a dream ends and you have to readjust to the waking world, except the readjustment takes the rest of your life and there is no going back to the dream. The 40,000 setting is not generally given to psychological realism in the modern literary sense, but this particular element, the chronic, ongoing loss experienced by voidfarers who come back late, is one of the places where the horror is quiet rather than loud. Where the monster is not a demon with too many teeth, but simply the passage of time, doing what it always does. But the standard time dilation, the 1:12 ratio, and its horrifying extremes, is not the only temporal phenomenon associated with warp travel. It is not even the strangest one. A ship can, under the right combination of circumstances, emerge from the warp before it entered. This is not presented as a common occurrence. The lore is careful to describe it as extremely rare, a navigation nightmare of the highest order, the kind of thing that happens to ships that have encountered some particularly violent or anomalous warp phenomenon. But it is described as possible, and in fact has happened. A ship can enter the warp at a specific point in time and, through some incomprehensible interaction of warp currents, temporal distortions, and sheer misfortune, emerge from the warp at a point in time before its departure. Yet the crew disembarks onto a platform where they have not yet left. They encounter earlier versions of themselves. They arrive carrying memories of events that have not yet happened. The Imperium has no framework for handling this. There is no protocol, no department, no accepted theological position on what the Emperor would want done in such a situation. The crew is usually quietly and efficiently eliminated, their testimony suppressed, as the incident buried deep in the archives where even most inquisitors will never find it. Because the implications, if such things are possible, if the flow of time can be so radically disrupted, are too dangerous to allow loose in the galaxy's collective consciousness. We will come back to that in a later section, when we discuss the organization specifically established to deal with exactly this kind of problem, and the very strange thing that eventually happened to them. But before we get there, let us talk about what happens when the situation is not merely inconvenient, when the ship does not arrive late, or arrive early, or drift off course. What happens when the warp does not let go at all? Now, there is something else worth pausing on before we move forward. The 1:12 ratio is presented in various editions of the game as an average, a baseline, a rough guide. But the word average carries within it an assumption about what the extremes look like. And the extremes in this case are genuinely staggering. If the average is 1 day to 12 days, the upper end of the distribution is not merely 1 day to 15 days. The upper end is 1 day to decades, 1 week to centuries. The bell curve of warp temporal dilation, if you could graph it, would have a tail that stretches so far to the right that it curves off the page and into what the statisticians would call a fat tail, one where the extreme outcomes are far more likely than a normal distribution would suggest. This matters because it changes how you think about the cultural impact of warp travel on the Imperium as a whole. If every transit carried only the ordinary risk of arriving a few months late, voidfarers would develop around that. They would build it into their plans. At insurance schemes, contractual clauses, simple social norms for dealing with delayed return. And to some extent they do. There is indeed an infrastructure for handling ordinary temporal drift, because it happens constantly, and the Imperium is pragmatic above all else. But the extreme cases, the ones that eat decades, that swallow centuries, these cannot be planned for. They cannot be mitigated by better paperwork or more careful scheduling. They are random in their occurrence, unpredictable in their severity, and catastrophic in their consequences for everyone involved. And they happen often enough to be not merely theoretical. Every significant void-faring culture in the Imperium has its folk traditions around them, its ghost stories, its cautionary tales, its rituals meant to propitiate whatever spirits might be responsible for sending a ship back to the wrong century. Just there is a particular class of these stories that circulates in the lower decks of Imperial Navy vessels. Stories about ships that arrived before they left. This is the temporal distortion that even hardened voidfarers are reluctant to speak about directly, addressing it instead through metaphor and euphemism. Taking the long way home, coming back through the early door. The wrong kind of shortcut. The accounts are fragmentary. Accounts are suppressed by the Administratum and the Inquisition with unusual thoroughness, but enough fragments survive to establish a consistent pattern. The ship makes an ordinary transit. The navigator plots a standard course. The Geller field holds. There is no storm, no significant anomaly, Nothing that anyone aboard would flag as unusual during the journey. The journey takes the expected subjective time. Days, weeks, whatever the route calls for. Yes, and then the ship drops out of the warp at the destination, or at least at the correct coordinates, and begins the process of making contact with local traffic control, identifying itself, establishing communications. The response it receives does not match its expectations. It is told that it was already here. That this ship, or a ship of this class with this registry number, departed from this location some number of weeks or months ago. Yet that its departure was noted, and that local records reflect its jump into the warp on the date of departure. But here is the problem. The ship is being told this before that departure happened. From the perspective of the ship's crew, they are arriving. From the perspective of local chronology, they have not yet left. The Inquisition classifies these events at levels of secrecy that most inquisitors never have cause to encounter. The reason, as the Ordo Chronos understood. It is not that the knowledge is particularly actionable. Most crews who experience this have not done anything specific with their inadvertent access to the recent past. It is that the knowledge is corrosive. The knowledge that time can move this way, that the arrow of causality can be bent so severely by passage through the warp, is the kind of knowledge that destabilizes belief systems. And in the Imperium, belief systems are a survival mechanism. The faith of the common soldier, that the certainty of the naval officer, the deep institutional trust that allows the Imperium's vast bureaucracy to function despite its many inefficiencies and corruptions. These things depend on a coherent model of reality, a model in which events have a fixed order, in which the future is unknown and the past is set. When that model breaks down, when it becomes clear that the warp does not acknowledge this model at all, the psychological effect can be severe. The Inquisition buries the reports, and the crews are quietly debriefed, sometimes medically treated, occasionally mind-wiped in the most extreme cases. The records are sealed, and the ships are sent out again because the Imperium needs its ships, and the alternative to sending them out is the slow death of isolation. Section 5. When the Geller field fails, the worst-case scenario. There is a spectrum of bad outcomes associated with warp travel, and most of them have been covered in some form by what we have discussed so far. Time dilation, lost years, the psychological horror of arriving to find everything changed. These are terrible things, but they are survivable things. Humanity endures them the way it endures almost everything, with gritted teeth, suppressed trauma, and a faith in the Emperor that may not answer every prayer, but at least gives the praying something to do. But at the extreme end of that spectrum, beyond the merely terrible and into the category of things that should not happen, is Geller field failure. The Geller field, as we discussed, is the bubble of real space that keeps the physical laws of the material universe intact around the ship during its warp transit. It is what separates the crew from the immaterium. It is, in the most literal possible sense, the difference between reality and dissolution. When it works, the worst of the warp's horrors are kept at bay. The demons can howl and press against the boundary all they like. The currents of psychic energy can surge and storm. As long as the field holds, the crew is safe. Not comfortable, not unaffected. Sensitive crew members, psychers especially, will feel the pressure of the warp's presence throughout any transit, but alive and sane and physically present in the universe. When the Geller field fails, even briefly, even for seconds, the results are immediate and catastrophic. The warp pours in, not metaphorically, literally. The physical matter of the ship begins to interact with the psychic medium of the immaterium in ways that physics has no language to describe. Crew members standing near bulkheads may find themselves partially merged with the walls. The metal of the hull may begin to develop characteristics that metal does not have. Breathing, bleeding, growing. The air takes on qualities that air is not supposed to have. The demons that were pressing against the outside of the field are now inside it, are manifesting into physical form, driven to immediate and violent action by the overwhelming hunger they have for mortal souls. Even a brief flicker, a momentary drop in field integrity and then immediate restoration can leave lasting marks on the ship and crew. Strange mutations, structural anomalies, crew members with memories they should not have, spaces aboard the ship that no longer behave consistently with their surroundings, a room where time moves slightly slower, yet a corridor where the temperature drops to absolute zero for no reason and then returns to normal, a cargo bay where things that were not there before appear at random intervals. A full Geller field failure, sustained for any meaningful length of time, is effectively the end of the ship. The crew will die, though that word does not quite capture what happens. They will be consumed by the Imperium. Their souls, their physical forms, yet their memories, all of it becomes material for the warp to work with. In some of the more haunting passages of 40,000 fiction, this is described not as death in the conventional sense, but as a kind of dispersal. The personality and consciousness of a human being, stripped from its physical housing and spread across the psychic medium of the warp, does not necessarily cease to exist. It becomes part of the warp's dreaming, howling, uncaring substance. The crewman, who once had a name and a family and a prayer they said every morning, is now an undifferentiated fragment of the psychic sea, contributing in some infinitesimal way to the emotional weather of a dimension that will never know or care that they existed. One of the most famous examples of Geller field crisis in the entire lore is the story of the frigate Eisenstein. During the early days of the Horus heresy, the loyalist captain Nathaniel Garrow commandeered the Eisenstein and made a desperate run for Terra to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal. To reach Terra in time, the Eisenstein was forced to push its systems well beyond their rated tolerances. Its Geller field began to fail during the transit. The ship became partially permeable to the warp. Demonic entities began to manifest aboard, targeting the ship's vulnerable psychers and working their way through the vessel. Yet the crew fought a running battle through the corridors of their own ship against enemies that shouldn't have been possible. They barely made it out. Many of them did not. The Eisenstein story is instructive because it involves a heroic crew who were actively fighting to preserve their ship and succeeded through genuine skill and courage. Most Geller field failures do not go that way. Most Geller field failures produce ghost ships, vessels that simply vanish from their routes and are never heard from again. The crews aboard them have no way to call for help, no way to signal their distress. There is no rescue possible for a ship lost in the warp. There is only the slim hope that the field will hold or come back online, and that the ship will find its way out before everyone dies. The Imperium accepts a small but significant percentage of its interstellar traffic being simply lost to these causes. Not because this is acceptable from a human standpoint, but because there is no alternative. This is the price of a galaxy-spanning civilization that cannot function without a mode of travel that runs through literal hell. The clerks of the Administratum note the losses in their ledgers. The bell of lost souls on Holy Terror rings for the ships and crews that do not return. And the next convoy sets out the following week, because the Imperium does not stop. It cannot afford to stop. Not for grief, not for fear, not for all the ships swallowed by the warp over 10,000 years. And some of those ships, it turns out, are not entirely gone. Some of them come back. Just not in the way anyone expected. Turn Section 6. The Ghost Ships, Space Hulks, and Frozen Time. There is a type of object in the Warhammer 40,000 universe that occupies a special place in the imagination of anyone who has spent time with this setting's lore. Not a demon, not an alien fleet, not a corrupted world. Something stranger, and in some ways more evocative than any of those things. A space hulk. At its most basic level, a space hulk is what happens when multiple ships, chunks of debris, asteroids, and other material get fused together by the energies of the warp over long periods of transit. The warp's reality-warping properties cause matter to behave in ways it normally wouldn't. Metals bond that shouldn't bond. Structures interpenetrate each other. Objects from completely different historical periods and completely different civilizations end up welded together into a single enormous mass.
Okay, I want to step out the lore for just a second and tell you why this topic personally messes with me more than almost anything else in 40k. Because when you look at the big stuff, the demons, the tyranids, the world-ending weapons, that stuff is horrifying. But it is also so far removed from anything real that you can hold it at arm's length. It is spectacle. But this temporal stuff, I can't do that. The idea that you could leave someone behind and come back and they're gone, not because something dramatic happened, not because of a war or anything like that, but just because time moved differently where you were and there was nothing either of you could do about it, that lands differently. That is a fear I actually recognize. The fear of missing time, of not being there, of the world continuing without you in ways you can't stop or predict. And I think that is why this corner of the lore sticks with me. It uses the scale of 40k to make something deeply human feel enormous. And I find that genuinely brilliant. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
Was the result is a structure that can range in size from something roughly comparable to a small city to something so massive it has its own gravity and atmosphere. A mountain of twisted metal and ancient hull plating, drifting through the void on no particular trajectory, obeying no particular schedule. Space hulks exit and enter the warp seemingly at random. They appear in real space, sometimes near inhabited systems, sometimes in the deep void between stars. It with no warning and no pattern that Navigator or Chronotech has ever been able to reliably predict. They drift for a time, hours, days, years. It varies wildly, and then they slide back into the warp as suddenly as they arrived. Centuries might pass before they reappear, often thousands of light years from where they were last seen. This behavior makes them both incredibly dangerous and incredibly valuable. They are dangerous because they carry things. And anything that was alive on the ships that formed the Hulk when they were lost in the warp may still be aboard, in some form. Genestealers, those terrifying avant-garde of the Tyranid hive fleets, have become so associated with space hulks that the boarding actions required to clear them of infestation have their own codified tactical doctrine. Chaos Marines use hulks as raiding platforms. They're riding them out of the warp and launching assaults on nearby systems before the Hulk dips back into the Imperium again. Feral human populations, the descendants of crews who lost their ships to the Hulk's gravity centuries ago, sometimes survive aboard them in primitive conditions. And stranger things besides. Things that the warp's long influence has changed in ways that make them very difficult to categorize. But they are also valuable because the ships that make up a Hulk might be ancient beyond reckoning. A Hulk might contain vessels from the age of technology, carrying technology that the Adeptus Mechanicus would send 100 explorator fleets to recover. It might contain weapons, resources, artifacts, anything. The Hulks are the ocean's flotsam, and in a universe 10,000 years old, the ocean has swallowed an almost incomprehensible amount of material. The temporal element of space hulks is one of the aspects that gets less attention than the Genestealers and the boarding horror, but it is arguably the most existentially strange thing about them. Consider what a space hulk actually is from the perspective of the ships that comprise it. Each of those vessels was, at some point, a functioning ship with a crew. Each of them made a warp translation, entered the Imperium, and at some point failed to emerge on the other side. Oh, some of them were probably caught in storms. Some of them suffered Geller field failures. Some of them simply got lost. But all of them ended up in the warp, and the warp, with its casual indifference to time, began to work on them. The crews of those ships might have been dead for 1,000 years. They might have been dead for 10,000. The interior of a space hulk might contain areas where time has been running normally, or approximately normally, since the ship was lost, producing generations of survivors who have no memory of a life outside the corridors of this thing. It might contain sealed sections where time has stopped entirely, where the original crew is preserved in a temporal stasis, not of their choosing, mid-action, mid-breath, frozen by some warp phenomenon that treated their lives as irrelevant to whatever it was doing to the flow of time in that section. Boarding teams report finding things in space hulks that stay with them. Meals on tables, they're still set for a crew long gone, but with food that has not rotted. Not because it was preserved in any mechanical sense, but because time simply stopped touching it. Officers' logs that end mid-sentence, navigation charts laid out for a course that no longer exists, crew quarters with personal items arranged as if the owner just stepped out, and sometimes, in the deepest and most disturbed sections of an ancient hulk, was something even stranger, evidence that the occupants of that space did not simply leave or die, but were caught in a temporal loop. The same events recorded again and again in different hands, in logs that span what should be thousands of years, but show no sign of the knowledge or perspective that thousands of years would produce. The same day lived over and over, while the rest of the universe moved on without them. The most famous space hulk in the setting's history, or at least the most narratively prominent, is the Sin of Damnation. When the Sin of Damnation appeared in real space near the Blood Angels' fortress monastery on Baal in the 41st Millennium, the Blood Angels dispatched their first company in Terminator armor to board and clear it. The hulk was infested with thousands of Genestealers. The boarding action was brutal and desperate. They fought through corridors where the geometry itself seemed to resist navigation, where the normal rules of directionality seemed to flex and bend, where teams that should have been heading toward the bridge ended up back where they started. This is not simply flavor. This is what happens to space aboard a ship that has spent centuries in the warp being worked on by forces that do not care about three-dimensional consistency. But there are hulks even more disturbing than the Sin of Damnation. While there are hulks that have been in the warp so long and have been so thoroughly saturated with its energies that boarding them becomes something approaching a journey through time itself. Tech Marine reports from certain expeditions describe moving through sections of the same vessel where the hull material is centuries newer on one side of a bulkhead than the other, or where instruments that measure the age of materials produce readings that should be impossible. Metal that is simultaneously ancient and brand new, organic matter that has been dead for 10,000 years, but is still warm to the touch. Where the crew, if any survive, includes beings who are recognizably human, but show signs of having been exposed to temporal distortions, so severe that they exist partially outside the normal flow of causality. But there are hulks even more disturbing than the Sin of Damnation. There are hulks that have been in the warp so long and have been so thoroughly saturated with its energies that boarding them becomes something approaching a journey through time itself. Tech Marine reports from certain expeditions describe moving through sections of the same vessel where the hull material is centuries newer on one side of a bulkhead than the other, or where instruments that measure the age of materials produce readings that should be impossible, metal that is simultaneously ancient and brand new, organic matter that has been dead for 10,000 years but is still warm to the touch. Where the crew, if any survive, includes beings who are recognizably human but show signs of having been exposed to temporal distortions so severe that they exist partially outside the normal flow of causality. And the documentation around Space Hulk boarding missions also reveals something that does not often get discussed in the broader context of how these operations are presented, the toll they take on the boarding parties themselves. Not just physically, though the physical toll is enormous. Genestealers, corrupted technology, structural instability, the ever-present risk of the Hulk disappearing back into the warp with the boarding team still inside. But something stranger. Something harder to classify in the Adeptus Mechanicus's meticulous injury and casualty reports. Boarding teams that spend extended time inside space hulks frequently report time passing differently inside the hulk than outside it. The teams are in Vox contact with their ships throughout the operation in most cases. Short-range communication systems work inside the hulk's bulk, though long-range astropathic communication is frequently disrupted by the residual warp energies. When these contact logs are compared, sometimes the timestamps on the boarding team's transmissions do not match the timestamps on the ship's receiving equipment. Not by much, usually minutes, sometimes hours, very rarely days, but consistently, and consistently in both directions. Sometimes the boarding team's time runs slower than the ship's. Sometimes it runs faster. The practical implications of this are significant and rarely discussed outside of specialist military planning circles. If you send a team into a hulk for what you estimate will be a 6-hour clearance operation, and time inside the Hulk is running at 2/3 the rate of outside, your team will emerge 8 hours later by ship time. Probably fine, probably not too depleted. But if time inside the Hulk is running at twice the outside rate, your team will be operating for 12 subjective hours in the 6 hours you have budgeted for them. They will be exhausted, their supplies will be largely consumed, and they will have aged, in terms of physical wear and psychological stress, twice as much as the operation was planned around. The Space Marines of the Adeptus Astartes are less vulnerable to this than ordinary humans. Their enhanced physiology handles extreme stress, fatigue, and physical deprivation far better than a baseline human soldier. But even they are not immune. And the reports that survive from major Hulk boarding operations sometimes contain notes, are buried in the casualty assessments and after-action analyses that individual warriors emerged from the Hulk showing signs of aging or injury or experience that did not match the time elapsed. Warriors who went in young and came out looking decades older. Warriors who went in with no particular psychological trauma on record and came out with the distant eyes of men who have seen things that should not exist. Some boarding teams do not come out at all. Not because they were killed in the conventional sense. There are no bodies, no equipment, no sign of battle. They simply stop transmitting at some point in the operation, and when follow-up teams reach their last known position inside the Hulk, there is nothing. The corridor is empty. The equipment is gone. The air has the still, untouched quality of a space that has been sealed for a long time. And the timestamp on the last communication, as compared to the time at which the follow-up team reaches the location, often suggests something disturbing. The first team's last transmission was recorded after the follow-up team entered the Hulk. They are not dead, or if they are dead, they died in a future that has not yet, from the perspective of the follow-up team, arrived. The Hulk swallowed them, and the warp's temporal currents are keeping them somewhere in the Hulk's history, in some past moment or some future one, and existing in a time pocket that the follow-up team cannot access. Perhaps they will emerge eventually. Perhaps they are still in there somewhere, in a moment that has not yet arrived from the outside universe's perspective. Perhaps the Hulk will take them when it next dips into the warp and deposit them in a real space timeline so far removed from the present that the distinction between them and the lost ships that built the Hulk in the first place is a matter of degrees rather than of kind. And the Hadex anomaly is perhaps the most concentrated example of the temporal horror that Hulks embody. This warp rift, located at the heart of the Jericho Reach in the eastern fringe, behaves differently from other warp phenomena. It does not simply corrupt the space around it. It spews time into its surrounding region, literally disgorging temporal energy from other dimensions into real space, disrupting the flow of events and occasionally reordering them entirely. Imperial scholars who have studied it from a safe distance describe it as appearing to have its own malign sentience, its own agenda with respect to time, and around its outer rim, like debris gathered at the shore of a cosmic drain, is a ring of ghost ships, dozens of voidcraft from multiple eras, from multiple civilizations, caught in what the scholastic lexicons call a state of temporal stasis. The ships are there, they are real, physical metal objects in real space, but time is not moving around them. Whatever was happening aboard those ships at the moment they were caught in the anomaly's influence is still happening, in the sense that it will always have been happening, and it will never progress further. They are frozen in the amber of a broken clock. Salvage expeditions that have attempted to approach the anomaly's ring of ghost ships have not returned. None of them. Which suggests that temporal stasis is contagious in that region, or that whatever is happening to those ships happens to anything that gets close enough to observe it properly. The Imperium has stopped trying to investigate. The ships are charted on navigation maps with warning sigils. The Hadex anomaly is avoided by everyone with any sense. And those ships hang there in the silence of a stopped moment, while the galaxy rushes on around them. Section 7. The Firehawks, a chapter devoured by the warp. So far we have been talking about ships, are crewed by ordinary people, baseline humans, the workers and soldiers and technicians and merchants who make the Imperium function. But the temporal horror of the warp does not discriminate by species or enhancement. It has claimed the transhuman as readily as the mortal. And the most haunting example of this in the entire setting, the case that raises questions about time and existence that the lore never quite fully answers, is the story of the Firehawks chapter and what they became. The Firehawks were a loyalist space marine. Chapter founded during the 21st founding, a founding so catastrophically cursed that it has its own sobriquet, the Cursed Founding, a name given to it because nearly every chapter it produced suffered from genetic defects, bad luck, or outright disaster. The Firehawks survived longer than most. They built themselves a legacy of destruction and wrath, a chapter known for relentless, a scorched earth offensive tactics, and a particular enthusiasm for fire as a weapon of war. They served through centuries of the Imperium's endless conflicts, earning honors and suffering losses in roughly equal measure. After the Badab War, a brutal internal imperial conflict fought in the early 900s of the 41st millennium that we do not have time to fully cover here, but which left the Firehawks reduced to roughly 22% of their effective fighting strength. The chapter was given time to recover, as they had their mobile fortress monastery, the ancient void fortress known as the Raptorus Rex, awarded to them centuries earlier for their service in the Age of Apostasy. They rebuilt slowly, and then, in the year 963 M41, they received orders. Eldar pirates were operating in the Crow's World subsector. The Firehawks were dispatched to deal with them. The entire chapter fleet, the Raptorus Rex, 5 support vessels, and over 800 battle brothers made the translation into the warp from the Piraeus system, 120 light years from Crow's World. They never arrived. The fleet jumped in and simply ceased to be. No distress signal. No scattered survivors emerging from the warp days or weeks later. No wreckage. No sign. The Firehawks chapter went into the warp in 963 M41 and were gone. The Imperium waited. Astropaths listened for any signal. Ships were dispatched to trace the route the Firehawks should have taken. Nothing. After what was deemed a suitable waiting period, the Administratum's protocols for declaring a chapter lost in the warp are, in the grim pragmatism that characterizes all imperial bureaucracy, quite specific. The Firehawks were declared dead. In 983 M41, 20 years after their disappearance, the bell of lost souls was rung 1,000 times on Holy Terror. 1,000 tolls, one for each of the 1,000 Space Marine chapters that compose the Adeptus Astartes. A black candle was said to have been lit in the Chapel of Fallen Heroes at the Emperor's express order. The Firehawks were mourned, their records sealed, their name added to the rolls of chapters that no longer were. And then things started happening. It began with sealed coffins, discovered aboard ships or left at space stations, bearing no identifying markings except the serial numbers of equipment registered to the Firehawks. The coffins were opened. Inside were Space Marines, or what had been Space Marines. Their armor, stripped of insignia and painted black, decorated with death motifs, skulls, bones, flames. The bodies inside were human, or had been human, but the state of decomposition was impossible. Not the decomposition of recent death, but of ancient death, a decay that should have taken centuries, present in bodies still wearing intact armor and holding weapons that showed no signs of comparable age. The investigations that followed were conducted by the Adeptus Mechanicus with all the discretion that institution is capable of, which is to say, they were conducted in near total silence, and the results were buried so deep that even most senior inquisitors have never seen them. But enough leaked out, in fragments and rumors, to tell a partial story. Almost a year after the first coffins appeared, an Imperial research station came under attack from greenskin pirates. The garrison was outnumbered and outgunned. After 3 hours of fighting, with the situation clearly hopeless, the attackers were suddenly hit from the rear. Black armored Space Marines appeared from nowhere. There was no ship in orbit, no teleportation signature, no recorded approach vector, and engaged the greenskins with overwhelming violence. Within half an hour, several hundred of the attackers were dead. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the warriors vanished again. As they left behind a banner, the gnarled chapter flag of the Firehawks, threadbare with apparent age, inscribed with the motto in High Gothic, In dedicato imperatum ultra articulo mortis. For the Emperor beyond the point of death. They also left behind a recorder, a data slate, sealed, with serial numbers that traced it back to the Firehawks fleet. When this recorder was eventually opened by authorized investigators on Terra and its contents examined, it told the story of what had happened to the Firehawks after their translation into the warp in 963 M41. The fleet had been caught in a warp storm of catastrophic intensity. Ship after ship was destroyed, absorbed into the Imperium. The remaining survivors fought off wave after wave of demonic entities trying to breach their Geller fields. Eventually, a single craft remained, but through a desperate emergency extraction maneuver, the kind that navigator lore describes as survivable in roughly 1 case in 10, that craft burst out of warp space, emerging far in the galactic east, thousands of light years off course and beyond the reach of the Astronomicon. They also left behind a recorder, a data slate, sealed with serial numbers that traced it back to the Firehawks fleet. When this recorder was eventually opened by authorized investigators on Terra and its contents examined, it told the story of what had happened to the Firehawks after their translation into the warp in 963 M41. The fleet had been caught in a warp storm of catastrophic intensity. Ship after ship was destroyed, absorbed into the Imperium. The remaining survivors fought off wave after wave of demonic entities trying to breach their Geller fields. Eventually, a single craft remained. Through a desperate emergency extraction maneuver, the kind that navigator lore describes as survivable in roughly 1 case in 10, that craft burst out of warp space, emerging far in the galactic east, thousands of light years off course and beyond the reach of the Astronomicon. What must it have been like in those final hours before the last ship made its desperate extraction? To stand in the corridor of a vessel that is the last surviving fragment of your entire chapter, feeling the warp press against the Geller field like a living thing, knowing that every brother who has died in the past hours is not merely dead in the conventional sense, but is being consumed by the Imperium, their souls and memories, and 10,000 years of combined service dissolving into the psychic sea. To watch the ship's chronometers and understand from the readings the navigator is shouting over the Vox that however much time feels like it has passed subjectively, where the warp's temporal distortion means you have no idea how long it has actually been. To not know even whether the outside universe will recognize you when you emerge, whether the Imperium you serve is still the Imperium you remember, whether the stars you can see through the navigation sensors from the real space side of the warp boundary are still inhabited by the civilizations you knew. The survivors came out into that uncertainty with the disease already working on them. The warp contagion that had taken hold during the storm, slowly destroying their sanity while paradoxically enhancing their physical capabilities, was already progressing. They were dying, not quickly in the way that combat kills, but in the drawn-out, inevitable way that a terminal diagnosis kills. They had months or years, depending on how resistant their enhanced physiology was to the specific character of what was consuming them. But they were finite. Their remaining time was measurable, and they chose to spend it fighting. What the recorder described next is where the story becomes genuinely strange. The survivors were approximately 200 space marines. Everything was lost. Their gene seed stocks, their initiates, most of their officers, their fortress monastery. They were stranded beyond the Astronomicon's reach, with no way to return, afflicted with a warp-borne disease of some kind, as a contagion that the lore describes as simultaneously destroying their sanity and enhancing their physical capabilities. They were, in any conventional military or organizational sense, finished. The chapter was dead, but they decided not to act as if they were finished. They stripped their armor of insignia. They painted it black and decorated it with whatever symbols of death each warrior found meaningful. They abolished ranks. Most of the officers were already dead. And the survivors decided that before death, all warriors are equal. And they made a decision that stands as perhaps the most defiant act in a setting full of defiance. They would spend whatever life they had left fighting for the Imperium, without expecting recognition or reward, without any realistic hope of survival. The Firehawks became the Legion of the Damned. Now here is where the temporal element becomes truly extraordinary. It's because here is where the lore gets genuinely strange in a way that the setting does not usually allow itself to be. The Legion of the Damned have been cited not just after 963 M41. They have been cited before it. There are documented instances of warriors matching their description: black armor, flame motifs, death imagery, appearing from nowhere and vanishing after the battle, occurring at dates before the Firehawks were ever lost in the warp. Warriors who died in battles fought before 963 M41 are sometimes described as having been aided by the Legion. If you look at the known encounters in chronological order, the timeline does not flow in one direction. The Legion appears to be operating outside of linear time. The most coherent theory offered by those few scholars who have had access to enough of the evidence to attempt a synthesis is that the warp transit that destroyed the Firehawks' fleet did not simply kill or transform the survivors. It sent them into a region of the Imperium where time does not flow in a single direction. While the survivors have been navigating the warp's temporal currents, by accident or by some guidance that the lore leaves ambiguous, appearing at moments of crisis for Imperial forces wherever and whenever such moments occur, regardless of whether those moments are in their subjective future or their subjective past. They are warriors who have been dead for decades fighting in battles that took place before they died. Yet they are soldiers serving the Emperor beyond the point of death, not metaphorically but literally, in the most temporal and physical sense possible. And they are still out there, still appearing when Imperial forces are on the verge of being overwhelmed, still vanishing afterward without a word, still wearing the black armor of warriors who have given up everything and kept nothing but their purpose. The bell of lost souls rang for them in 983 M41, but it rang too soon. Or perhaps not soon enough, or perhaps for the last time. In the warp's relationship with time, these distinctions do not necessarily mean what they normally would. Section 8. The Eye of Terror, where time has no meaning. If individual ships experience temporal distortion during warp transit as a side effect of the Immaterium's nature, and if space hulks represent the accumulated temporal wreckage of millennia of that distortion, then the Eye of Terror is what happens when temporal distortion is not a side effect, but the fundamental condition of existence. The Eye of Terror, the Ocularis Terribus, is the largest and most significant region in the galaxy where the warp and real space permanently overlap. It was not created by a technological accident or a ship's failed navigation. It was created by an act of creation so massive and so traumatic that reality itself cracked and has never healed. Was when the Eldar civilization, that ancient, galaxy-spanning empire that made the Imperium of man look young and small, collapsed through its own hubris and spiritual corruption, the psychic resonance of the collapse birthed a new chaos god. Slaanesh, she who thirsts, the prince of pleasure and pain. The birth of Slaanesh generated a psychic shockwave that physically destroyed most of the Elder Empire, and consuming billions of souls in an instant and tearing a wound in reality that spans roughly 20,000 light-years in diameter. The Eye of Terror is not a region of space that is near the warp. It is a region of space where the warp and real space have become the same thing, where the physical laws of the material universe are not merely bent, but replaced wholesale by the laws of chaos, which are not laws in any meaningful sense. In the Eye, time is, to use the law's own phrasing, a meaningless concept. Think about what that actually means. We take time for granted as the most fundamental structure of existence. Even in the most extreme physical conditions, we can theoretically describe, near the event horizon of a black hole, moving at relativistic speeds. Time still flows. It may flow at a different rate relative to an outside observer, but it flows. There is still a before and after. There is still causality. There is still the possibility of a clock that, while however strange its relationship to other clocks, is at least internally consistent. In the Eye of Terror, this is not the case. The warp's nature, that ocean of emotion and psychic energy that does not follow physical causality, is not just present in the eye, it is dominant. The physical universe is the minority partner in the eye's reality. And the warp's relationship to time is not simply different from ours. It is the negation of the very concept of a consistent temporal flow. Yes, the demon worlds within the eye exist in their own sub-realities. Each is a place where a different chaos god's influence shapes the fundamental parameters of existence. On a world devoted to Nurgle, the passage of time is marked by cycles of decay and renewal that bear no relationship to any external standard. A moment might feel like centuries of slow, oozing dissolution, while what the outside universe experiences as 10 years passes in what feels like a single afternoon. On a world devoted to Khorne, time might be experienced purely in terms of combat. The time between the first blow and the last, measured not in seconds but in the quality of the violence. On a world devoted to Tzeentch, on a world devoted to the architect of fate, time is a toy, a plaything, something to be taken apart and reassembled in configurations that serve the purposes of a being that exists in all moments at once. But the most significant practical consequence of this temporal chaos is one that the lore addresses directly, and that has been a foundational element of the Chaos Space Marine's identity since the earliest editions of the game. After the Horus Heresy, after the final battle at Terra, where Horus was slain, and the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne, the remaining forces of the 9 traitor legions were driven back into the Eye of Terror in a campaign called the Great Scouring. They retreated into a dimension where time had no meaning, where the physical passage of 10,000 years would not necessarily be experienced as 10,000 years. And as a result, the same Chaos Space Marines who fought the Emperor's own Primarchs during the Horus Heresy are still alive, still fighting, still issuing from the Eye to attack the Imperium they betrayed 10,000 years ago. Ancient warriors in ancient armor, scarred by ancient wounds that should have killed them, are fighting with the same hatred they felt when they first turned against the Emperor. This is one of those elements of 40k that is easy to state and surprisingly easy to accept, because the setting presents it so matter-of-factly, but which is genuinely extraordinary when you stop and think about it. An ultramarine in the current era, a warrior born in approximately the 41st millennium, might find himself in combat against a world eater who participated in the Siege of Terra. Not a descendant, not a successor. The actual warrior, 10,000 years old, sustained by the warp's temporal indifference and the ruinous power's investment in keeping their champions alive. The gap between them is not just ideological, it is temporal. It is an almost incomprehensible weight of years and experience and horror, all compressed into a single black-armored warrior who should be dead 10,000 times over and simply isn't. When Chaos Space Marines emerge from the Eye to raid, to conduct black crusades, to hunt for old enemies, or simply to kill, they step from a place where time means nothing into a universe where 10,000 years have passed since they last stood in real space. They carry with them memories of a galaxy that no longer exists. They hate people who are not only dead, but so long dead that their very bones have dissolved. They fight for causes that were decided before the current Imperium existed. They are, in a very literal sense, ghosts, as warriors from another time, haunting a present they were not supposed to be part of. The psychological effect of this on those Marines who retain enough sanity to be self-aware about their situation, which is not many, but some do, is something the novels of the setting occasionally touch on with surprising depth. What does it mean to have been angry for 10,000 years? What does it mean to have been afraid for 10,000 years? What does it mean to carry a grudge across a span of time so vast that human civilization has risen and fallen and risen again in the interval? The answer, in most cases, is madness. The answer is what you see in warriors like Han the Betrayer, whose hatred has been so perfectly preserved by the warp's temporal stasis that it has calcified into something approaching a fundamental force of nature. Not a feeling anymore, but a condition of being. The Eye of Terror also generates temporal whirlpools, localized distortions in the space-time near its boundary that can catch ships and throw them off course in time as well as space. Ships that venture too close to the Eye without adequate warp navigation can be flung backward in time, or forward, or trapped in loops. The law is reasonably clear that this happens regularly enough to be charted. There are warning zones around the Eye that navigators maintain and update. Regions labelled on warp charts with sigils that translate roughly to "Here there be temporal monsters." Ships that ignore these warnings are occasionally recovered, most are not. Inside the Eye itself, the temporal distortion is so severe that no consistent navigation is possible. The chaos forces that operate within the Eye do not navigate to specific destinations. Yet they launch themselves into the currents and trust to their patron gods to bring them out somewhere useful, or at least somewhere there are enemies to fight and souls to claim. This is, from a strategic military standpoint, a significant limitation, but it is also, from a certain perspective, a strength. The unpredictability of when and where chaos forces will emerge is itself a tactical advantage. No defense can be completely prepared for an attack that might come from any direction, but at any time, against any target. The Chaos Space Marines of the Traitor Legions are, in this sense, one of the most unsettling things in the entire setting. Not because of their power, though their power is considerable, but because of what they represent temporally. They are walking anachronisms. They are living proof that the warp's relationship to time is not merely an abstract inconvenience, but a force that can preserve individual human beings across spans of time that make civilizations look temporary. The Emperor of Mankind has been on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, deteriorating but deathless, and his worst enemies have been in the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years, preserved by chaos rather than sanctified machinery, or hating every moment but unable to die and unwilling to stop. There is a narrative weight to this that the 40,000 setting handles with surprising sophistication in its best moments. The novels set during the Black Crusades, the periodic, devastating surges of chaos forces out of the Eye of Terror and into Imperial space, sometimes show Chaos Space Marines who are aware of what they have become. But warriors who remember the Emperor not as a distant god-emperor, entombed in gold, but as a man they once served. Who remember the Primarchs not as legendary figures of myth, but as commanders who once gave them orders in person. Who carry within their enhanced, long since corrupted memories the specific texture of a reality that no longer exists. These are not sympathetic figures. The corruption that has sustained them for 10,000 years has done terrible things to them, but they are, in a strange way, witnesses. They are the only mortal beings still alive, in whatever sense that word applies, who remember the galaxy before the Horus Heresy, before the Emperor was entombed, before the Astartes were divided into chapters, before the great era of expansion that defined the early Imperium gave way to the long, grinding defensive struggle that the 41st Millennium represents. When a Chaos Space Marine looks at a modern Ultramarine, here he is looking at someone whose entire civilization, whose entire worldview, whose entire conception of what the Imperium is and should be, was built in the shadow of the Chaos Marine's betrayal. The Imperium that exists in the 41st Millennium is defined, to a very significant degree, by the Horus Heresy, by the wars and losses and changes that the traitor legions caused. And here they are, the survivors of those legions, still fighting, still causing damage, still as convinced of the righteousness of their cause, or at least as committed to the destruction of the other side, as they were when they first turned. Time has passed around them while they remained in their temporal bubble. The wound they caused has had 10,000 years to become the Imperium's fundamental identity, and they are still here, reopening it. That is temporal horror of a very particular kind. not the cosmic horror of ships dissolved in the warp, and not the personal horror of arriving centuries late, but the sustained, unresolvable horror of a conflict that cannot end, because one side is exempt from the passage of time in any meaningful sense. The Eye of Terror also generates temporal whirlpools near its boundary, localized distortions in space-time that can catch ships and throw them off course in time, as well as in space. Navigators avoid the Eye with a thoroughness that borders on phobia. What the training logs of navigator houses include extensive documentation of near misses, with the Eye's temporal boundary effects, ships that came within a certain range, and felt time begin to behave incorrectly before they were able to pull back to safety. Ships that did not pull back in time became cautionary tales. Ships that definitely did not pull back in time are listed in the Voidfarer's equivalent of a missing persons record, which in the Imperium's context means they are listed in the archives as lost in the warp, and their bells have been rung and their names have been spoken over ceremonial fires, and that is the end of their official story. Section 9. The Great Rift and the Noctis. Eterna, galaxy-scale temporal catastrophe. Everything we have discussed so far, the temporal distortions of individual warp transits, the frozen time aboard space hulks, the eternal limbo of the firehawks, the 1,000-year suspended animation of the Eye of Terror. These are, in the context of Warhammer 40,000 scale, individual incidents, specific cases, terrible, yes, and wide-ranging in their implications, but they are things that happen to ships, to chapters, to regions. What happened in 999.m41 is different. It is something that happened to the entire galaxy. The Great Rift, also known in High Gothic as the Cicatrix Maledictum, yes, the Cursed Wound, is a galaxy-spanning tear in reality that erupted across the entire width of the Milky Way, beginning with the fall of the fortress world of Cardia during Abaddon, the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade. We will not attempt a complete account of the events that led to it here, because it involves decades of build-up and multiple catastrophic incidents across the entire galaxy, and that is its own video entirely. What matters for our purposes is what the Great Rift did to time. The rift is, in essence, what would happen if you took the Eye of Terror, that region of permanent warp real space overlap, and stretched it across the entire galaxy instead of confining it to one region. It runs from the Eye of Terror itself in the galactic northwest all the way to the Hardex anomaly in the galactic east, an almost unimaginable distance, a wound across the body of the galaxy that made the Eye look like a scratch. When the rift opened, it released a wave of warp energy into real space on a scale that the universe had not experienced since the fall of the Eldar. That wave swept outward from the rift in all directions simultaneously, and where it passed, the laws of physics, including the laws that govern the flow of time, came under severe pressure. In some regions, they broke entirely. In others, they merely bent. The Games Workshop described this directly and explicitly when they used the Great Rift to transition the setting to 8th edition. The inconsistencies of time fluctuations, once largely localized to larger warp storms such as the Eye of Terror, spread across the galaxy. Some worlds felt standard centuries go by in an instant, while others were all but frozen in time, and still others have suffered constant temporal shifts. Let that sit for a moment. Not a ship, not a region, worlds. Some worlds experienced centuries compressed into moments. Other worlds stopped in time entirely. Still others have been caught in ongoing temporal instability, experiencing time at erratic and unpredictable rates that make any kind of reliable contact with the broader Imperium nearly impossible. This is not a localized disaster. This is not something the Imperium can throw resources at and solve. This is the galaxy itself being broken. And the temporal dimension is just one of the ways in which it is broken. The immediate aftermath of the rift's opening produced what the Imperium calls the Noctis Eterna, the eternal night, also known simply as the Blackness, or in Low Gothic, the Days of Blinding. This was the period immediately following the rift's formation, when the psychic shockwave of its birth dimmed the Astronomicon. That lighthouse burning from holy terror, powered by thousands of dying psychers, as the fixed reference point that every navigator in the galaxy depends on, it went dark. Not permanently, not completely, but enough to make navigation effectively impossible across most of the Imperium for a period of time that varied wildly by location. On Terra itself, the disruption lasted 33 solar days. 33 days of darkness, of silence, of a galaxy cut off from its own means of communication and navigation. On Terra. Elsewhere, it lasted longer. Much, much longer. Some planets experienced the Noctis Eterna for decades, not because the Astronomicon was actually dimmed for decades from a Terran perspective. It was restored relatively quickly, but because those planets were in regions where time was accelerating relative to Terra, where the warp's temporal effects were so severe that 33 Terran days of disruption translated to decades of local time before the beacon became visible again. Yet these worlds were effectively cut off, unable to send or receive astropathic messages, unable to navigate warp routes, isolated from any hope of rescue or communication for what felt to their populations like generations. Historians and chronoscribes of the Adeptus Administratum, who tried to reconstruct events after the fact, describe the frustration of working with records from this period. And the accounts coming in from different regions are so temporally inconsistent with each other that establishing any coherent chronology is essentially impossible. They cannot tell you whether event A on planet X happened before or after event B on planet Y. They cannot tell you whether the forces that arrived to reinforce a beleaguered system got there in time because of the time dilation or arrived too late because of it. The temporal fracturing of the galaxy has made history itself uncertain in a way that was never true before. The imperial calendar itself became unreliable. Robert Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, resurrected after 10,000 years in a near-death state following a poisoning at the Battle of Thessala, revived to lead the counteroffensive against the Great Rift's consequences, had to address this directly. Upon his resurrection and return to active command, he discovered that the imperial calendar had accumulated errors through the centuries of temporal distortion even before the Great Rift. The calendar was potentially off by as much as 1,000 years in some of its dating. After extensive consultation with his historiators and the surviving members of the Ordo Chronos, Guilliman made a proclamation. There could no longer be a unified imperial calendar. The galaxy was simply too temporally fractured for a single chronology to apply. Each region, and each subsector, each system, would have to maintain its own local dating, referenced against the moment of the Great Rift's opening as the common anchor point. The Cicatrix Maledictum became the event that the new calendar was organized around. Not a date, because dates had become unreliable, but an event. Something that had happened to the whole galaxy simultaneously, or as close to simultaneously as the Rift's nature allowed, and which every part of the Imperium could reference. This internal conflict over the dating system became known as the Chronostrife, a formal dispute within the Ordo Chronos and related scholarly organizations about how to reconcile the irreconcilable temporal data coming in from across the galaxy. It is, in the context of the ongoing apocalypse that is the 40k setting, a remarkably gentle kind of disaster. But it speaks to something profound. When time itself stops being a consistent shared experience, civilization becomes harder to maintain. Not just practically harder in a deep philosophical sense. History requires a shared chronology. Justice requires a shared sense of before and after. Planning requires a shared expectation of when cause will produce effect. The Great Rift attacked all of these things simultaneously. But here is what I find most compelling about the Great Rift's temporal implications, from a lore perspective. Before the Rift opened, temporal distortion was a localized problem. It was a problem of individual ships and specific routes, and the particular hazards of specific warp phenomena. It was a problem that, while never fully solvable, could at least be managed by good navigation, careful route planning, and the continued functioning of the Astronomicon. The Imperium had had 10,000 years to develop practices and protocols for the ordinary temporal horror of warp travel, and while those practices were imperfect and those protocols often failed, they existed. But they constituted a body of knowledge, a set of tools, a framework for dealing with a known class of problem. The Great Rift dismantled that framework overnight, not by eliminating the tools. The navigators are still there, the Astronomicon still burns, the Geller field technology still works, but by changing the fundamental conditions against which those tools are applied. The temporal distortions that were once localized to the Eye of Terror and certain specific anomalous regions are now galaxy-wide. The warp's influence on the flow of time in real space is no longer something that happens inside the warp or near specific warp phenomena. It is now something that is happening everywhere, to varying degrees, continuously. The worlds caught in the worst of this are experiencing time in ways that make coordination with the broader Imperium essentially impossible. And a world where a standard century passes in what feels like a year cannot reliably communicate with a world where a year feels like a century. They are not just geographically separated, they are temporally separated, existing in different relationships to the flow of time, connected by nothing except the physical fact of both being in the same galaxy, and even that connection is increasingly tenuous as the rift continues to generate and sustain the temporal chaos. The Imperium's response to this has been characteristic. Acknowledge the impossibility of the old framework, develop a new framework that is slightly less impossible, and carry on. Guilliman's calendar reform, the Chronostrife's eventual resolution, is exactly this kind of characteristically imperial response. Not a solution, not a fix, but an adaptation. An acknowledgement that the universe has changed the rules and a determination to function under the new rules regardless. A bureaucratic response to an existential crisis, which is almost the defining move of the Imperium across its entire history. But I want to dwell for a moment on what it means that the Chronostrife happened at all. That the galaxy's most powerful remaining institution, the Imperium of Man, with all of its military might and its ancient history and its vast administrative machinery, had to hold a formal dispute over what year it was. Yes, because the Great Rift had broken time so severely that even the basic question of when events occurred could no longer be answered with confidence. The Chronostrife is the Imperium admitting, in the specific language of institutional conflict and policy debate, that causality has become negotiable, that history has become unreliable, that the shared chronology that connects all human beings to each other and to their past is no longer functioning as a shared chronology, and they resolved it. Guilliman and the Ordo Chronos and the Historiators worked through it and produced a new system and issued a proclamation, and everyone agreed to use the new framework going forward. That is not a victory. It is the Imperium doing what it always does, finding a way to keep going despite the impossibility of its situation, which is, in its way, the most genuinely heroic thing about the setting, not the battles and the martyrs and the space marines with their chainswords, but the clerks and the scholars and the administrators who keep finding ways to make things work, however imperfectly, in the face of a universe that is trying very hard to make everything stop working. The Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, the half of the Imperium on the far side of the rift from Terra, is where the temporal effects have been most extreme and most lasting. With the Astronomicon's light blocked by the rift, us worlds in the Nihilus have experienced the Noctis Eterna not for 33 days, but for years, decades, lifetimes. Some of them are still experiencing it. The rift is still there, still roiling, still generating temporal chaos in the space around it. In the Nihilus, fleets navigate blind, worlds fall in isolation without any possibility of rescue, and entire civilizations mark the passage of time by reference points that have no meaning to anyone on the other side of the rift. And there are space marine chapters in the Nihilus who have been out of contact with the wider Imperium since the rift opened. Some of them are still fighting. Some of them have been fighting in conditions so temporally distorted that the centuries since the rift may feel like a different length of time to them than it does to their brothers in the Imperium Sanctus. When and if contact is re-established, there will be a reckoning, not a hostile one, but a quiet and devastating one, where warriors who have been fighting in isolation discover how much time has passed and what it means for everything they thought they were fighting to preserve. Section 10. the Ordo Chronos, the Watchers who vanished. Given everything we have covered, it might seem natural to ask, what does the Imperium do about this? Not the individual cases. We have covered how the Administratum notes the losses, how navigators try to minimize temporal drift, and how voidfarers develop coping mechanisms for arriving late. What about the systematic problem? What about the fact that time itself is unreliable in a universe structured around a mode of travel that runs through a dimension where time doesn't work? The answer, of course, is that the Imperium has an organization for it. The Imperium has an organization for everything. And in this case, the organization is the Ordo Chronos. The Ordo Chronos is one of the Ordos Minoris of the Inquisition, the smaller, more specialized branches of that vast and secret organization, compared to the three great Ordos Majoris of the Malleus, the Hereticus, and the Xenos. Most Inquisitors have never heard of the Ordo Chronos. Most senior Imperial officials are unaware of its existence. It is deeply obscure, deeply strange, and deeply concerned with exactly the phenomena we have been discussing. The Ordo's original mandate was specific, to study and counter the potential ramifications of temporal displacement caused by warp travel. They were particularly focused on the extreme end of the problem, not the standard time dilation that every voidfarer accepts as an occupational hazard, but the cases where ships emerge from the warp significantly displaced in time, and especially the incredibly rare but deeply alarming cases where ships emerge before they departed. Yet their concern was simple and logical, even if the phenomenon that generated it was neither. If a ship can travel through the warp and emerge in the past, then the crew of that ship possesses knowledge of future events. They know what will happen. They know which battles will be won and lost, which planets will fall, which leaders will rise, and which will betray their oaths. This knowledge, in the wrong hands, or even in the right hands, used carelessly, could alter the flow of events, as could interfere with what the Ordo Chronos, with the perhaps inevitable language of the Inquisition, called the Emperor's intentions for mankind. Over the centuries, the Ordo Chronos expanded their investigations beyond the originally narrow mandate. They began looking into all forms of temporal anomaly, not just warp travel-induced time travel, but deliberate attempts to manipulate the flow of time, the temporal distortions associated with places like the Eye of Terror, as the strange time effects produced by certain Xenos technologies, the behavior of regions like the Hadex anomaly. They became, essentially, the galaxy's most qualified experts on time as a broken and potentially weaponizable phenomenon. And then every single member of the Ordo Chronos disappeared simultaneously, not gradually, not through a series of unrelated incidents, in a single moment, or what appeared from the outside to be a single moment, which is itself a suspicious qualifier in any discussion of temporal phenomena. Every Inquisitor connected to the Ordo Chronos vanished or went into hiding. Their bases went dark. Their records were either destroyed, hidden with extraordinary thoroughness, or, and this is the theory that tends to keep people up at night, retroactively removed from history in a way that leaves only traces, echoes, the sense that something should be there but isn't. Nobody knows what they found, whilst the Inquisitors who have tried to investigate the Ordo Chronos disappearance, and there have been some, inevitably, because Inquisitors are drawn to mysteries the way moths are drawn to flames, have found only fragments. Whispers of involvement with technologies that the Adeptus Mechanicus classifies as forbidden, even by that institution's extremely high standards for forbiddenness, and hints of contact with entities or phenomena that the investigators' reports describe only as the source of the anomaly, which is not a description that helps. References, in what few surviving documents can be traced to former Ordo members, to a discovery that changed their understanding of the nature of time so fundamentally that continuing to operate within the Inquisition's framework became either impossible or undesirable. There is a theory, not official, not endorsed by any imperial authority, but circulating among those rare scholars who know the Ordo Chronos existed at all, that the organization did not simply disappear, that they are still there, still active, but operating in a temporal context that makes them invisible to ordinary investigation, that they are, like the Legion of the Damned, operating outside of linear time, that whatever they discovered was not a threat to be reported but a condition to be entered, and that they entered it intentionally. If this theory is correct, the Ordo Chronos is still investigating temporal anomalies caused by warp travel. They are just doing it from outside the normal flow of time, which presumably gives them access to information and perspectives that would otherwise be impossible to obtain, but which makes any kind of conventional contact with the rest of the Inquisition essentially impossible. More recently, in the early years of the 42nd millennium, or in the era Indomitus following the Great Rift, there have been signs that the Ordo Chronos may be active once more. Whether this represents the original members returning from wherever they went, a new organization reconstituted under the old name, or something stranger than either of those options, the lore does not currently specify. But Guilliman's post-Rift reorganization of the Imperium included consultation with what his staff described as the Ordo Chronos in resolving the chronostrife and establishing the new dating system. Whoever or whatever spoke with the Lord Commander of the Imperium on the subject of broken time was apparently authoritative enough to affect Imperial policy. The Ordo Chronos is, in its own small way, one of the most purely unsettling elements in this entire setting. Not because of the scale of its concerns, but because of what its disappearance implies. An organization full of the most paranoid and capable investigators in the galaxy, equipped with the full resources of the Inquisition, dedicated specifically to understanding temporal anomalies. And the temporal anomalies won. Whatever the warp showed them about the nature of time was powerful enough to take an entire secretive organization off the board in a single move. That is not a comforting thought. But more recently, in the early years of the 42nd millennium, in the era Indomitus following the Great Rift, there have been signs that the Ordo Chronos may be active once more. Whether this represents the original members returning from wherever they went, a new organization reconstituted under the old name, or something stranger than either of those options, the law does not currently specify. Yet but Guilliman's post-Rift reorganization of the Imperium included consultation with what his staff described as the Ordo Chronos in resolving the chronostrife and establishing the new dating system. Whoever or whatever spoke with the Lord Commander of the Imperium on the subject of broken time was apparently authoritative enough to affect Imperial policy. The Ordo Chronos is, in its own small way, one of the most purely unsettling elements in this entire setting, not because of the scale of its concerns, but because of what its disappearance implies. An organization full of the most paranoid and capable investigators in the galaxy, equipped with the full resources of the Inquisition, dedicated specifically to understanding temporal anomalies. And the temporal anomalies won. Whatever the warp showed them about the nature of time was powerful enough to take an entire secretive organization off the board in a single move. That is not a comforting thought. Thus, there is one final dimension of the Ordo Chronos worth thinking about, which the lore gestures toward without quite saying directly. The Ordo Chronos was concerned specifically with temporal displacement that could result in crews arriving in the past with knowledge of future events. Their concern was that this knowledge could alter the flow of history in ways that undermined the Emperor's plan for humanity. This implies, fairly directly, that the Ordo Chronos believed there was a correct flow of history, a specific sequence of events that was intended, that had a purpose, that led somewhere meaningful. They were not simply concerned about causality violations in the abstract. They were concerned about interference with a plan. Whose plan? In the Imperium's theological framework, the Emperor's. But the Emperor has been sitting on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, unable to communicate clearly with anyone. It kept alive by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every single day, existing at the intersection of the material and the immaterial in a way that no other being in recorded history has managed for so long. His intentions are, to put it charitably, opaque. The Inquisition interprets them. The Adeptus Custodes guard them. The High Lords of Terror claim to act in accordance with them. But nobody can ask him directly. Nobody has been able to ask him directly since Horus struck him down at the Battle of Terror. The Ordo Chronos was in the business of protecting a plan they could not verify existed in service of an intelligence they could not directly consult against interventions in a timeline they could not fully comprehend. They were, in essence, doing the Imperium's most thankless and most impossible job, trying to impose order on time itself, in a universe where time is subject to the chaos of the warp. Hired on behalf of a god emperor who might or might not still have opinions about how things should go. And then they vanished. And whether they vanished because they discovered the plan was real and needed protecting from a threat they could not counter within the normal operating parameters of the Inquisition, or because they discovered there was no plan at all, and that knowledge was the kind that could not be allowed to circulate, or because time itself swallowed them as it swallows ships and chapters and entire eras of history, we do not know. The warp has its secrets, and the Ordo Chronos is one of them. Section 11. The Human Cost. What it means to return. We have been, for much of this video, operating at the scale of fleets and chapters and entire galactic events. That is appropriate. The temporal implications of warp travel in 40k operate at every scale, and some of the most significant examples are enormous. But there is a quiet, personal dimension to this topic that I want to spend some time with, because I think it is one of the places where this particular element of the setting says something true and affecting about the human experience, even through the lens of a universe that is deliberately, almost gleefully, over the top in its grimness. The Voidfarers of the Imperium are not a monolithic group. They range from the wealthy merchant captains of rogue trader dynasties, and with their palatial ships and their charters of imperial authority, to the lowest-ranked ratings who scrub decks and maintain bilge pumps in the deepest parts of aging freighters. What they share is a life lived between the stars, in vessels that traverse the warp, and with that life comes a relationship to time that is fundamentally different from that of planet-bound people. In the naval traditions of ancient Earth, sailors developed their own cultures and social systems shaped by long absences from home, the knowledge that you might be gone for months or years, the strange temporal dislocation of returning to a world that had moved on without you. But those sailors, for all the hardship of their voyages, returned to a world where time had passed at the same rate for everyone. If you were gone for a year had passed. Your parents were a year older. Your children were a year taller, and the math was simple, even if the emotional adjustment was not. For a Voidfarer in the Imperium, the math is not simple. It is never simple, and the emotional adjustment it demands is not the adjustment of someone who has been away for a long time. It is the adjustment of someone who has been removed from time. There are accounts, in the setting's fiction, in the background material, as in the fragments of personal narrative that occasionally surface in the vast flood of 40k lore, of voidfarers who step off their ships after what feels like a routine transit, and discover that years have passed on the world they left. A woman who left her aging mother in reasonable health and returned to find her long dead, the grave already weathered and mossy. A soldier who shipped out for what the convoy papers said would be a 6-month resupply run, and returned to find that the civil war they were bringing supplies for had been over for 8 years, and the political landscape had changed so completely that the faction they served no longer existed. A navigator who has made the same run between 2 worlds so many times that she has lost count of how many years have passed on those worlds since she started, while she herself has aged what feels like decades less. This creates, in the communities of Voidfarers, a particular social adaptation, a different relationship to attachment, to planning, to the concept of home. The most experienced Voidfarers do not maintain homes on specific worlds. They maintain relationships with other Voidfarers who share their temporal experience. They mark time not by the galactic standard calendar, which is unreliable anyway, even setting aside individual warp transit variation, but by the internal records of the ships they serve on. The ship's clock, however imperfect, is at least their clock. It measures the time they have actually lived, as opposed to the time that has passed in the universe at large. There is a particular toll taken on families. The children of voidfarers often have complicated relationships with parental figures who are present for stretches of time and then absent for what might be years, who return looking barely changed while the children have visibly aged, who bring gifts and stories from across the galaxy but cannot always remember which stories they have told before, because from their perspective certain conversations happened very recently, and from the child's perspective they happened years ago. The mathematics of warp travel does not respect the rhythms of human development and relationship. When there is also the matter of what happens when a voidfarer experiences extreme temporal displacement, not the ordinary drift, but the catastrophic cases where a ship arrives decades or centuries late. The Imperium has protocols for this, because it has had 10,000 years to develop them. A ship that arrives significantly late is typically quarantined upon emergence, its crew assessed, its logbooks examined. They are not treated as threats per se, though there is always an inquisitorial element to the assessment, because temporal displacement this extreme can produce unintended knowledge of past events that the Inquisition prefers to control. They are treated as something between survivors and visitors from another time, which is more or less what they are. As the psychological assessment conducted on crews in this situation tends to reveal a consistent pattern that the Administratum's chirurgeons have documented extensively enough to have given it a name. They call it temporal displacement grief, and it is exactly what it sounds like. The survivor has lost not just time, but context. The people who knew them on the planet's side of their lives are gone. The organizations they served may have changed beyond recognition. The wars they understood are resolved. The causes they believed in may have triumphed or failed in their absence. They are alive in every physical sense, but the world they were alive in is gone, replaced by a world that has grown up around an absence shaped like them. What the Imperium does with these people, how it integrates them, supports them, makes use of them, varies by circumstance. Experienced voidfarers are valuable, regardless of when they left. Their knowledge, however dated, as is specific and real. Their skills are not diminished by the passage of time. In practical terms, they are usually absorbed back into the voidfaring community, where at least their temporal oddity is relatively accepted, where the people around them have their own complicated relationships with the calendar, where the question of what year it is has never been a simple one. But the grief does not go away. The loss of a world that continued without you, the loss of time that you did not lose, that was taken from you by the indifferent physics of the Imperium, is not the kind of loss that has a resolution. There is no closure available. There is no ceremony that acknowledges what happened in a way that actually addresses it. There are only the people who survived the same transit and came out at the same temporal point, sharing the same dislocation, who understand in a way that planet-bound people never quite can. There is also a particular dimension of this grief that we should not pass over without acknowledging, because it is easy to think of temporal displacement primarily as something that happens to the voidfarer, but it also happens to the people who were left behind, and they are rarely the ones whose experience gets centered in these discussions. Consider the family of a crew member on a freighter that was swallowed by a warp storm. They watch the ship depart. They wait. When the expected return date passes, they notify the relevant authorities. The Administratum's Bureau of Voidfarer Welfare, a notoriously overburdened and understaffed office that processes an enormous number of late return notifications each year. The Bureau files the notification, assigns it a case number, and places it in a queue that, given the Bureau's resources, will likely not be actively investigated for several years at minimum. The family waits. Months pass, then years. They receive no word. At some point, a decision must be made. Practically speaking, a determination of legal death must be obtained if the family is to resolve financial matters, inheritance, property, the thousand small administrative tangles that attach to a person in the Imperium's bureaucracy. This requires petitioning the Administratum for a declaration of presumed death, as a process that takes its own time and generates its own paperwork, and is handled with the same grinding bureaucratic slowness that the Administratum applies to everything. Eventually, the paperwork goes through. The family receives a document. The person they knew is officially dead for administrative purposes. And then, sometimes, years later, sometimes decades later, sometimes generations later, the ship comes back. The crew steps off, disoriented, grieving their own lost time, looking for the people they left. The ship's internal log says 3 months have passed. The external calendar says 12 years, or 30, or 80. The crew member who had a family looks for them. The family, those members of it who are still alive, who were not themselves subsequently killed by the endless wars and hazards of imperial life, must deal with the return of someone they officially buried, who is physically younger than their own children, or who carries memories of a household that no longer exists in the world, but still exists in perfect detail in the returner's mind. The Imperium does not have good mechanisms for this. It has legal processes for reversing declarations of presumed death. It has limited counseling resources provided by the Ministorum through their welfare offices. It has, in theory, support networks run by various charitable organizations associated with the Navy and the merchant fleets. In practice, and most of what it has, is the quiet stoicism of a population that has been through too much to be surprised by any particular form of grief, and the somewhat bleak comfort of knowing that you are not the only one in this situation, that this has happened to thousands of people before you and will happen to thousands more after. There is also, it must be said, a darker human cost to warp travel's temporal effects. Not just the grief of dislocation, but the despair of repetition, of doing a job that feels endless, not because it is endless, but because each time you return from the warp, the problems are the same, but the people are different. The enemy keeps coming. The Imperium keeps fighting. The needs of the galaxy's wars keep pulling voidfarers out into the dark, through the warp, and back again, over and over, while the universe around them ages faster than they do. Long-term voidfarers, people who have spent decades of subjective time in transit, and who have survived multiple major warp transits and accumulated all the temporal drift those transits involve, sometimes develop what their colleagues recognize as a weariness that goes beyond normal fatigue, a sense of having watched too much pass by, too quickly, while they were away, a disconnection from the urgency that drives most people, because urgency implies a deadline, and they have learned that deadlines cannot be trusted. The voidfarers of the Imperium are, in a sense, at the universe's most accidental time travelers. They did not choose to cross time. They chose to cross space, and time came along as an unpredictable passenger. And they pay for that, in ways that are quiet and personal, and never quite visible to the people who stayed behind. Section 12. The horror and the wonder of eternity. We have covered a great deal of ground in this video. From the basic mechanics of how the warp disrupts time to the galaxy-scale catastrophe of the Great Rift. From the frozen ghost ships of the Hadex anomaly to the temporal warrior mystery of the Legion of the Damned. From the 10,000-year suspended rage of the Chaos Space Marines to the quiet personal grief of a voidfarer who came home to find her world had moved on. What does all of this add up to? Let me try to synthesize something from all of this before we close, because I think there is a thread running through every specific example we have covered, every mechanic and every narrative. That connects them to something larger. The standard framing for warp temporal effects in 40k discussion tends toward the spectacular. The Firehawks, lost and transformed. The Eye of Terror, where 10,000-year-old warriors still fight. Space Hulks frozen in stopped time. These are the stories people tell because they are dramatic and strange, and they capture something vivid about the setting's character. And they should be told. They deserve the attention. But I want to suggest that the most significant thing about warp temporal distortion in this setting is not the spectacular cases. It is the cumulative weight of the ordinary ones. Every single transit through the warp costs something. Even a good transit, a clean one, a route well charted with calm conditions and a skilled navigator and full Geller field integrity. Even that transit has a ratio. Even that transit means that more time passes outside than inside. Every ship that has ever made a warp jump has given up a piece of the consistency of time, a small slice of the shared chronology that connects one event to another, one person to another, one world to another. And the Imperium is built entirely on top of this. Every supply chain, every military campaign, every communication, every piece of coordination that allows 10,000 worlds to function as a coherent civilization, rather than 10,000 isolated rock and water spheres lost in the dark of space. All of it runs through a medium that doesn't know what time is. This is, when you think about it, one of the most genuinely bold world-building choices in the entire setting. The Imperium of Man is one of the most recognizable iconic science fiction empires in popular culture, famous for its scale and its grimness, and its baroque military aesthetics, and the civilization that produces all of that, the 10,000 worlds, the Space Marine legions, the Inquisition, the vast and grinding bureaucracy, is connected to itself by roots that are fundamentally unreliable with respect to the most basic parameter of organized civilization: time. In a setting that loves to examine how things that should work don't quite work, how grand institutions are held together by faith and stubbornness rather than genuine competence, how the appearance of order sits on top of a reality of controlled chaos. The warp is the ultimate expression of that principle. It is the fundamental transportation infrastructure of the Imperium, and it is broken. It has always been broken. It will never be fixed. The people who use it know this, and they use it anyway because they have no choice. And because the alternative, the complete disconnection of the Imperium's worlds from each other, is worse. The Emperor on the Golden Throne understands this, if he understands anything anymore through the haze of continuous psychic agony in which he exists. The Astronomicon, that lighthouse he powers with his own will and the lives of thousands of his psychers, is his response to it. Not a solution, because there is no solution, but a guide, and a fixed point in the temporal and spatial madness of the immaterium, something that the navigators can orient to, something that makes the worst of the chaos navigable, even if not predictable. It is the Emperor holding one thing steady in a universe of flux, and it costs him everything, every day, without end. That is not nothing. That is, in the specific context of warp temporal distortion, a meaningful gesture toward the possibility of order. Not order achieved, but order attempted, and continuously, at enormous cost against all odds. The voidfarers who sail through the warp are, in their own way, doing the same thing. They are holding one thing steady: the ship's clock, the crew's subjective timeline, the mission they were sent to complete, in the face of a universe that is trying very hard to make all of those things irrelevant. They are insisting that their time matters, that their experiences matter, that the fact that they have arrived matters, but regardless of when the warp has decided to deposit them. And most of the time, not all of it, but most of it, they make it. The Geller field holds. The navigator finds the Astronomicon. The ship drops out of the warp at the destination, in the right century, or at least a workable one, and the crew is alive, and they go about their work, and the Imperium continues. That is what it means to endure in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Not triumph. Triumph is rare and temporary, not certainty. Certainty is unavailable, and any claim to have it is either ignorance or a lie. Just the continued refusal to stop in the face of a universe that is doing everything in its power to make you stop. The willingness to keep sailing through a sea that eats time because there is something on the other side worth reaching for. There is something deeply human in that, genuinely human, in the best and most complicated sense of the word, are frightened and determined and aware of how fragile the whole enterprise is and going anyway. Keeping the clock running even in a place where time has no meaning, because the clock is the only thing that connects you to the world you came from and the world you are heading toward. The warp is the darkness between the stars, and it has been eating ships and crews and centuries for as long as humanity has sailed it. It will keep eating them. There is no redemption arc available for the immaterium. At no version of events in which it is tamed or resolved or made safe. But the ships keep going. The fires of the Astronomicon keep burning. And somewhere out there, in the churning dark of the Imperium, a vessel with a full crew and a purpose, and a navigator with a steady hand, is finding its way home. That is the story of warp travel and time in Warhammer 40,000. And I find it, beneath all the horror and the grimness and the spectacle, quietly extraordinary. There is something I want to suggest, not as a definitive interpretation, but as one way of understanding why this particular element of the Warhammer 40,000 universe resonates the way it does. The setting is famous for its scale and its darkness, the sheer number of ways it finds to be grim, the relentlessness of the horror it projects. And the temporal element of warp travel is absolutely part of that darkness. It is horrifying, genuinely horrifying, and in a quiet way that the more operatic horrors of the setting sometimes overshadow. But there is something else going on in the temporal element, something that I think sits alongside the horror rather than simply contributing to it. The warp's relationship to time is ultimately an expression of the setting's core philosophical position, that the universe is vast, indifferent, and incomprehensible, and that the response to this is not to surrender to it, but to push back against it. Every voidfarer who steps onto a ship heading for the warp is, in some sense, accepting a bargain with time. They are saying, I accept that I do not know when I will arrive. I accept that the world may have changed in my absence. I accept that time will work against me and around me in ways I cannot predict. But I am going anyway, because there is something on the other side worth going for. This is, at its core, a statement of human, or in 40k terms imperial, stubbornness. The refusal to let the incomprehensibility of the universe prevent the necessary act. The imperial creed is not an optimistic one. It does not promise that things will be fine. It promises that they will not surrender. And in the context of warp travel's temporal horrors, surrender would mean not going at all. It would mean the Imperium's 10,000 worlds ceasing to communicate, to trade, to support each other. Or it would mean the isolation that is already threatening vast swathes of the Imperium Nihilus, expanded to encompass everything. Instead, the ships keep going. The navigators keep opening their third eyes. The Geller fields keep projecting their bubbles of real space into the howling dark. And the voidfarers keep accepting the bargain, time after time, transit after transit, because the alternative is worse. The Legion of the Damned embodies this in a particularly pure form. Our warriors who have lost everything. Their chapter, their brothers, their health, their certainty about when they exist in time. Still fighting. Not because they expect to win, not because they have been promised anything, but because they decided that service to the Emperor was worth more than the certainty of time. They gave up linear existence and kept the thing that actually mattered to them. That is horrifying, yes, but it is also, in its own strange way, extraordinary. The warp's relationship to time is ultimately a mirror held up to all of those things in human experience that make us feel most helpless. The inability to know what the future holds. The way the world keeps moving while we are not looking. The grief of returning to find things changed. The fear that time is running out, or running in the wrong direction, or running faster than we can keep up. These are not specifically 40k anxieties, as these are the anxieties of being a mortal creature in a universe that does not care about you. The 40k setting takes those anxieties and makes them literal, makes them physical, makes them things that can happen to ships and fleets and entire chapters and ultimately to the galaxy itself. And by making them so extreme, so obvious, so unavoidable, it gives them a kind of clarity that abstract philosophical discussion rarely achieves. You cannot look at the temporal horror of the warp and pretend it is not there. You cannot look at the Legion of the Damned, fighting in battles that happened before they died, and not feel something about the weight of time and what we do with the time we have. And maybe that is why, despite everything, the Imperium keeps sending ships into the warp. Not because it is safe, not because the temporal distortions are acceptable, but because the only alternative, to stop, to stay still, and to surrender to the enormity of the problem, is the one thing that a species that has survived this long cannot afford to do. They go in. They trust the Geller field. They follow the Astronomicon. They come out somewhere on the other side of time, whenever and wherever the warp decides to release them, and they begin again.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.